Following the defeat of Jack Lynch and Fianna Fáil in the 1973 general election, a coalition of Fine Gael and Labour came to power. Liam Cosgrave was elected Taoiseach over 50 years after his father had held the same office.
At Arasanuk Throin, more photographers, as Mr Cosgrave went in to report his election as Taoiseach to President De Valera and to receive his seal of office.
Fianna Fáil had been in power for 16 years, so we now have a government led by Liam Cosgrave with the support of the Labour Party. And one of the very important things about that government is that Cosgrave and the Labour Party leader, Brendan Corish, established a very good relationship.
He was excellent as Taoiseach, very good with Labour. He gave him an extra ministry beyond what was their proportionate share. He worked very well with them.
There was great unity in that government. I cannot remember really any decision which was taken on, party lines.
Beside that very comfortable relationship between Cosgrave and Corish, and they did have a very comfortable relationship, you had Conor Cruise O'Brien and Gareth Fitzgerald, who were very taciturn, reluctant to speak, slow to give an opinion.
Do I hear the note of irony somewhere?
But he did have a great ability, Rory, didn't he, to allow stronger personalities
Absolutely.
to flourish. And he was quite happy, you know, as kind of chairman to sit back and listen and let them play out there on the stage.
He very much saw the government as a team, as opposed to perhaps the De Valera approach to it, where you were the chief. I mean, very much so. And I think Cosgrave epitomised that.
When he was leader of the opposition, he was getting unfair treatment from the media. But extraordinary, once he became Taoiseach, his image vastly improved because people saw there was mettle in this man, that he could deal with a difficult situation.
We have emphasised that all economic and social progress depends on stability and security. That stability is not possible unless people know where they are. They know where they are with the government, both here and in the north, and people recognise that what we've done in the field of security is essential for economic progress.
They're initially presented with the problem of the north. There's escalating violence. The British government was moving towards setting up a process to try and find a solution. Jack Lynch had just about started that process when Cosgrave government came in, and they conducted the negotiations for what became known as the Sunningdale Agreement. This was a very far-seeing agreement. It involved power sharing between nationalists and unionists. It involved a Council of Ireland, which was an overarching body which would have had some links between North and South. It was an agreement, though, that was opposed by Republicans and ultra-loyalists.
Sunningdale was a good plan, but it should have been put to the people. And you rightly, the reason they didn't put it to the people is it would have failed. Unionists would have said, I'm not voting for any plan which gives power to the South. Nationalists would have split, I suppose, RCLP versus the Shiners. We never got the chance to vote on it anyway.
The Sunningdale Agreement collapsed because IRA violence continued and escalated, but it was brought down by a loyalist workers' strike when the British government of Harold Wilson refused to stand up to the loyalist workers and basically suspended the agreement. Cosgrave was bitterly angry with Harold Wilson, whom he distrusted and disliked intensely from the word go. But the British government let Cosgrave down and let the Irish people down.
If the British government had remained in power, if Ted Heath had remained there, he would have insisted on the British Army dealing with the workers' strike. But the very weak Labour government, led by Wilson, whose anxiety was to get out of Northern Ireland altogether and to leave it behind. It was a disastrous change of government from our point of view. And as a result, the whole thing collapsed. The workers' strike brought down the executive, and it took a long time to get back from there. Some mistakes on our part, possibly, but mainly the British government, the weaknesses of the British government, new British government, meant that it took another decade and more to solve the problem.
In April, when Liam Cosgrave went to see Harold Wilson, after the formal discussion, I was listening to what he's saying to somebody or other, and they were talking about the North, and one of Wilson's comments was, why don't we let them hang each other, or words to that effect. And that was Wilson's instinct all the time, to get out, to cut and run, to leave the spongers, as he called the northern people, to look after themselves. Now, we had to analyse what would happen in that condition, and that's how we had come to the conclusion of the threat of civil war hanging over the whole island and the possibility of British withdrawal within a very short time. So the situation was pretty dire.
I remember that if you rode from Dublin to Belfast or Derry or Tyrone or Fermanagh, you'd come across young men on the road looking for a lift because they wanted to go north to engage in military activity. It was as straightforward as that.
Well, once the Sunningdale Agreement collapsed, the Cosgrave government was left then with a containment policy on the north. Violence continued and escalated, and there was a lot of spillover into the Republic.
In May 1974, 4 car bombs in Dublin and Monaghan left 33 people dead. The UVF claimed responsibility for the bombings as a reaction to the Sunningdale Agreement.
They thought that they could bomb us down here. We would abandon our attempts to resolve the situation in Northern Ireland.
Threats to the state added to the many difficulties faced by Cosgrave and his government. Economic concerns would also prove challenging. The Yom Kippur War had led to the Arab oil embargo, which in turn created a world energy crisis.
The oil price rocketed, and we were suddenly presented with massive inflation, with huge economic problems. Initially they borrowed very heavily to try and maintain social services through the worst of the recession. They then tried to scale back and start scaling the borrowing down as they got towards 1977. As they tried to contain and scale back the borrowing, they got into trouble with the public. Richie Ryan, the Minister for Finance at the time, was dubbed Richie Ruin by his political opponents, and the name stuck. So the government had a really difficult time both on the front, the security front, and on the economic front.
That was one of our disappointments in government, that we had to be controlled by forces which were beyond our control, and we were not able to implement all that we had wished to execute. You had to deal with the emergencies and the problems that arose overnight.
One such emergency occurred in October 1976 when the President of Ireland, Carol O'Dowley, resigned amid controversy.
President, in a few words, can you say why have you resigned?
My few words are few, and they're to be found in the documents which I have somewhere or other in the papers I've taken with me, which I'll let you have immediately when I can. Obviously someone has taken them into the house, go looking for them, and it's as plain and straightforward as I put them in these papers. I don't want to say any more than this.
What happened with Carol O'Dowley and the insult to the President is that the Minister for Defence, Paddy Donegan, who was a very close friend and ally of Liam Cosgrave, went to an army barracks in Mullingar and said the President was a thundering disgrace, or at least this is what the reporters said afterwards. But he insulted the President. Again, there was a context list. He didn't do this just out off the top of his head. He did it following the murder of the British ambassador. After the British ambassador was murdered, the government brought in emergency legislation which would allow for 7-day detention. The President summoned the Council of State to ask was it constitutional. At that meeting of the Council of State, he was told that by virtually everybody present, including the Chief Justice, that it was constitutional, but he referred it to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court did find that it was constitutional. Cosgrave and members of his government believed that Carol O'Dowley was behaving in a very difficult and truculent manner by doing that. Carol O'Dowley regarded himself as a much more Republican. He would have traditional Fianna Fáil Republican views, and they felt that that was behind the attitude he was taking. So this is what prompted Paddy Donegan to call the President a thundering disgrace.
In the military barracks in Mullingar, he castigated and criticised the President for referring the legislation to the Supreme Court, which was perfectly within the remit of Carol O'Dowley, the President, to do, and I think he was probably correct to do so. And that created a crisis because O'Dowley wanted an apology. Donegan offered his resignation to Liam Cosgrave. Liam Cosgrave was too blind and too loyal to accept it, and it went from bad to worse, and eventually O'Dowley resigned.
I think it would have been better if he had accepted Paddy Donegan's immediate offer of resignation in view of what he'd said and the impact that would have on the President. When Donegan's resignation was not accepted, the President then felt that he had to leave office. He wasn't comfortable in office. He wasn't enjoying it, so it didn't take an awful lot to precipitate a resignation.
The coalition was in enough trouble anyway because we'd gone through economic times, but this was offending the institutions of the state. And for many people from the Fine Gael tradition, Donegan's attack on the presidency and on the institution of state was unacceptable. And within 7 months later, in June of 1977, the Fine Gael Labour government lost its majority.
In 1977, Liam Cosgrave called a general election. The Fine Gael Labour coalition was confident of a victory after Labour Minister James Tully redrew constituency boundaries in their favour.
There was a constituency review during the time of the Cosgrave government, and the Minister for Local Government was James Tully, a hard-nosed Labour politician from County Meath. And he decided he was going to rig it in favour of Fine Gael and Labour, unashamedly, unabashedly. All the political pundits at the time forecast that Fine Gael and Labour would win the 1977 election because they'd be doing so well in by-elections. So he went for a series of 3-seat constituencies, on the argument being that Fianna Fáil would get 1, Fine Gael would get 1, and Labour would get 1, and it would give Fine Gael and Labour a clear majority.
The Tully-Mander was brilliant for the Fine Gael Labour coalition if, in fact, the swing was within a certain margin. But if the swing went beyond that margin, then it rebounded as a disaster. Nobody expected the swing.
When Jim Tully produced his draft for the revision of constituencies, I said, this is based on the assumption that the government will be as popular when the general election comes as it was in 73, 74. And I said, if that doesn't happen, then you're going to have a most awful result. And that's what happened.
Calling the election in June, half the government felt we should wait till the autumn, perhaps the more urban people in particular. I was surprised that Liam Cosgrave decided to go in June. It was a mistake, but on the other hand, I doubt whether the difference in June and October would have prevented us losing government.
Instead of Fianna Fáil winning 1, Fine Gael winning 1, and Labour winning 1, Fianna Fáil won 2 in almost all the 3-seat constituencies. Fine Gael and Labour lost seats all over the place. Jack Lynch won the election in 1977 with the biggest ever majority in the history of the state.
While the results of all the counts are not yet available, the indications are there will be a change of government. I would like to pay tribute to my cabinet colleagues who have worked so diligently during the last 4 difficult years for true national advancement. I believe that ultimately their work will be vindicated.
He felt probably that he was a liability because of the defeat of the government. In fact, I think had he stayed on, he would have been subjected to more criticism, and he would have appreciated the need for the Fine Gael party to unite around a new leader, and so he bowed out.
I think that was a mistake. I think it was a mistake for himself, actually. I think it had a negative effect on Irish politics subsequently and on the role of Taoiseach subsequently, because it set up the expectation from then on that if you lose the general election, you should resign or you're going to be pushed or you're not going to last around very long.
And Cosgrave immediately resigned. Within weeks of the election, he stepped down, and so did the Labour leader, Brendan Corish. But it was the end of Liam Cosgrave's political career, and the Tully-Mander played a role in that.
Jack Lynch and Fianna Fáil were returned to power with a huge majority after promising sweeping tax cuts. But Lynch would soon find his leadership challenged from within.
You had a 77 election which promised, in fact, to make sweeping changes in the tax system, and in particular to take away rates on residential property. Now that was just an enormous boom, but people saw this was going to be a fantastic benefit to get rid of rates. The economists, of course, would be very unhappy with the idea of getting rid of rates, because what actually happened was rates were abolished in that giveaway budget, and within 12 months, the price of housing had capitalised the value of the rates that had been removed. And it was like as if people said, well, now that I don't have to pay these taxes, I can pay more on my house. So you got massive house inflation in that period, driven by the removal of rates.
Oh, we worked out at home, my wife and I, you know, the cash value of Fianna Fáil policy. We'd be daft not to vote for it. We were going to gain whatever it was, you know. Abolition of rates, the abolition of road tax. It's crass. You have to provide finance for building roads. You have to take away all the shit and refuse from a house. You can't do it out of nothing. You know, it's crazy.
People will say that the promises made at that time weren't real and weren't realistic or weren't economically sound. I'm not an economist. I don't have a competence in that regard. But elections are all about winning, and he won that one historically. But it was a piece of history I think he could have done without. Probably one of the worst victories Mr. Lynch ever experienced, because he knew and everybody else knew that the majority was too big, and a majority of that size is far too big and far too unmanageable. The less of a majority you have, the better you can control your party in the context of divisions and so on, because they're more alert and people become arthritic and lethargic when they see that there's 20 of us more than the other side. It's bad. It's not good. And as I say, the 77 election from Mr. Lynch's point of view, and I think he knew it himself, that his time was running out for him with a majority of that nature.
There are people who entered the Dáil for Fianna Fáil in 1977 whom Lynch doesn't even know who they are, but Taoisigh knows who they are. And he's been cultivating them for some time. And they are going to support him when the contest comes.
From 1970 onwards, due to the arms crisis, Charlie Taoisigh more or less had to lick arse and grovel. Taoisigh would have seen himself that he had to put the party before everything. I'd say much to his great personal annoyance, he had to more or less grovel to these people. He did so because he wanted to get back. He did it, I'm sure, for his own reasons. But that was the Fianna Fáil way, you see.
In 1975, he came back onto the front bench in opposition as spokesman on health and social welfare. And then in 77, after the general election in 1977, he became Minister for Health and Social Welfare.
He would have been conscious of cultivating backbenchers and, you know, befriending candidates throughout the country and that. And, you know, I mean, you know, to a certain extent, that was there anyway. People were either for Charlie Taoisigh or they were against Charlie Taoisigh. So I suppose it was inevitable, therefore, that he would be very close to some members of the parliamentary party and not close to others.
Taoisigh was extraordinarily popular within Fianna Fáil. And the calculation may have been Lynch's part. That as Lyndon Johnson famously said once, it's better to have your enemies inside the tent pissing out than outside pissing in.
I think that a number of people said we have at least as much right to be Taoiseach as he has, apart from a little matter to the party voted him in. But, you know, in a sense, we are our own gods. And then when the Northern, of course, he had the great election victory, but then the Northern troubles break out, and this gives them their chance.
Last night's death toll was the worst suffered by the British Army in any single incident in the 10 years they've been here. The 18 deaths make yesterday the worst single day of violence in the north since the present wave of troubles began.
On the same day that 18 British soldiers were killed in Warren Point, the IRA assassinated a relative of the British royal family. Lord Louis Mountbatten died after a bomb exploded on his boat off the coast of Sligo.
I think he went through the worst period of any Taoiseach that I have had knowledge of. He had the burning of the embassy, he had the Bloody Sunday, he had the introduction of internment, he had the growth of the Provisional IRA, he had many, many other atrocities. He's coming back into a situation on the north which hasn't improved. If anything, it may even have got slightly worse.
Lynch was not the Lynch who was Taoiseach in the late 1960s. I don't think he had the same energy. And I think from that point on, having won that, he was looking for a time to go. And he'd more or less made up his mind he was going to go in 1980. In the event, he went earlier because he was forced out due to a combination of circumstances. Losing 2 by-elections, criticism of him within the parliamentary party for overflights by British helicopters, but issues which were essentially manoeuvred and manipulated by the Republican element who were supportive of Haughey within the party.
You know, sometimes you in any walk of life, whether it's politics or commerce or any of these things, you give your heart and soul to them and you find that there's no response and you say, well, I think it's time to move on. And that was Mr. Lynch's view in life. And in politics, it was time, I think, after he had lost 2 by-elections. At that time, he decided that he'd move on.
And he decided to go in partly exasperation, I think, in the end of November, '79. It was a mistake, as we now know, in the sense that I think he thought the succession was pretty secure to George Colley. He'd have been happy with that, but that was a miscalculation.
Jojo Dullard was last seen speaking to her friend at a phone box.
She was hitchhiking from Dublin back to Kilkenny when she went missing.
She's always in my heart.
We delve into the case of Jojo Dullard. Crime in Mind, Monday at 9 on 3.
I feel you might have taken too long for me to feel.
Ford Focus TDCi from €16,834, including scrappage. The Ford Focus, more as standard.
Loud noises won't usually wake you, but wetness on your skin could disturb your sleep. That's why new Pampers Baby Dry helps keep you dry and speeds wetness away faster than before. So even your skin could have an undisturbed night of golden sleep. New Pampers Baby Dry. Peaceful nights, playful days.
At Subway, we do things differently, like put meatballs in bread. We got sauce from the Southwest of America, not Cornwall. We even got a guy who just bakes the bread. Hey, bread guy. Yep, we're from the US of A, where the customer is #1. So let these guys ask you some easy questions, then make a sub that's individual to you. And now get a regular 6-inch sweet onion chicken teriyaki and drink for just $3.99. Subway, eat fresh.
Call the party line 1550 69 69 69 or text BLURT to 57333. Chat to single girls in your area. Listen to hundreds of intimate personal ads. Make friends and maybe more. Party line, the fun way to meet single girls. Call 1550 69 69 69 or text BLURT to 57333.
Excess stomach acid causes heartburn and indigestion. Rennie directly targets the source by starting to turn excess acid into water and other natural substances in just 2 minutes. Rennie turns excess stomach acid into water and other natural substances in just 2 minutes.
Hey, are you following me?
Whatever you've eaten throughout the day, chewing Wrigley's Extra helps keep your teeth clean and mouth fresh. Whatever you eat, chew Wrigley's Extra. And now, Wrigley's Extra lasts even longer to help keep your teeth clean and mouth fresh.
Have you got lazy yourself?
That's what Squiggly used to do. It's good, this.
Got your meat on, isn't it? Go on. Do you fancy lighting fire?
We're dependent on you.
We'll put the kettle on.
It's really good watching them working together, being friends, helping out.
In 1979, following the resignation of Jack Lynch, Charles Haughey became leader of Fianna Fáil and Taoiseach. However, not everybody was happy with his succession, as the leader of the opposition, Gareth Fitzgerald, pointed out almost immediately.
When Haughey became Taoiseach in December 1979, it's always a great occasion when the Dáil elects the Taoiseach, and it's a great occasion for that person and their family, and people make speeches. And usually they're wishing the person well. Gareth made a couple of remarks, certainly one of which he actually later said he regretted. But he said on that occasion, the occasion of Haughey's election in the Dáil, he said he comes with a flawed pedigree. His motives can ultimately only be judged by God, but we cannot ignore the fact that he differs from his predecessors in that these motives have been widely impugned, most notably by those in his own party who have observed him over many years.
Read what I said. I said simply that all previous leaders of governments here had the solid support of their parties in what they were doing and were able to act effectively. He didn't have that support and disrespect his flawed pedigree. The phrase was unfortunate, but that was all I was talking about. And if you read the paragraph, you'll see it's all there. The question was that he didn't have the solid support of his own party. 40% of them thought he was totally the wrong person to lead the government. You can't run a country effectively in those circumstances. That was the trouble.
You must recall that Mr. Haughey's wife and family were up in the Dáil gallery, proudly looking down at their husband, father, being made the leader of their country, and to have the leader of the opposition come up with that sort of glib, I thought, and mean and unnecessary remark.
The sparring between them is legendary, and it was always Gareth the Good and Charlie the Bad with horns, as my mother once said.
He was an autocrat, of course, and he operated, I thought, by fear. He was a small man, and I think that was part of his problem, really. And I'm a student of Napoleon myself, and he saw himself as sort of in a Napoleonic context. He was the ruler. I lead, you follow me, unquestionably. And I thought that was his stock in trade, and that's how he operated.
As Haughey came to power, the economy was struggling as a result of another oil crisis. Within a month of becoming Taoiseach, he decided to address the nation.
Good evening. I wish to talk to you this evening about the state of the nation's affairs. And the picture I have to paint is not, unfortunately, a very cheerful one. The figures which are just now becoming available to us show one thing very clearly. As a community, we are living way beyond our means. I don't mean that everyone in the community is living too well. Clearly many are not, and have barely enough to get by. But taking us all together, we have been living at a rate which is simply not justified by the amount of goods and services we are producing.
He was living way beyond his own means, that he was living like Renaissance prince. He was taking money with both hands from anybody who would give it to him. So he was a very complex character.
Of course, when he became Taoiseach, in comes the compromises. There's very little radicalism in Haughey. One of the most extraordinary compromises is one that's not really remembered. When he first held office, there was a car plant, I think it was a car assembly plant out in Santry called Talbot. It was to close. Something went wrong. It was another victim of the recession of those times. And the workers protested, naturally enough. And Haughey took all of those employees, or a good number of them, onto the state payroll, guaranteed them salaries for life. Quite extraordinary. And this was the same man who was making broadcasts addressed to the nation. We all know we are living beyond our means. You are indeed, Charlie. The idea that the Prime Minister of a country intervenes with the private industry and says to the workers who've very sadly lost their jobs, don't worry, we'll put you on the state payroll for the rest of your life. Quite incredible. I mean, absolute fecklessness with public money.
With the economy continuing to deteriorate, Haughey decided to call a general election in 1981.
I have decided that the holding of a general election should not be further delayed. I have accordingly today advised the President to dissolve Dáil Éireann, and polling will take place on Thursday, the 11th of June.
Nervous Garrett, saintly and much loved by the people, and Nervous Charlie, who had every sort of two horns and a tail, you know, and cloven hoof. It was astonishing, that. He had unwavering belief in himself. Like, he really did believe he was the smartest guy in the country, and that there wasn't anybody out there, certainly not in politics, and I don't think he ever met them in business, who was his own equal. He had no, as they say, issues of self-esteem.
I think it was very, very important that Garret FitzGerald was around at that time. He was the most popular Fine Gael leader ever. It was very important that you had the choice between two strong leaders for Taoiseach at the time. All the more important now that we know what Mr. Haughey was doing. I think the most important thing about Garret, when you strip everything down, is that he was there to keep Charlie Haughey out of office.
In June 1981, Garret FitzGerald was elected Taoiseach, leading a Fine Gael Labour minority coalition.
Yeah, when we became Taoiseach in 81, I didn't realise just how bad the financial situation was. That had been hidden, in part. Cuts announced in spending in the spring had never been given effect to 105 million, which is a lot of money in those days. Nothing even done about them, just announced, and that was left like that. So we had a much worse financial position than I expected. You know, to be told as soon as you're elected, and before you formed the government, that's a national emergency, you'd have to call an emergency cabinet meeting, bring an emergency budget within 3 weeks. That wasn't quite what I expected. Plus, of course, the hunger strike at the same time.
The salient thing to say about the hunger strikes is, who would have thought that they'd fast to death? That was a big change in Northern consciousness. An agonising death, and they face it one after the other, and we're beginning to say, because, you know, the IRA are criminals, the IRA are killers. The IRA were our neighbours and pretty useless too. You'd see them go down the street, you know, that guy's in the IRA. Didn't know he could open a ton, never mind fire a gun. You think, well, I never knew they had it done them. From then on, in the north, among the Fenians, you do not denigrate the IRA. Nobody can call them cowards. We can still criticise them. I can pick holes. There's a new feeling about them. And a sense of, for Christ's sake, Britain, would you give them a pair of jeans and jumpers? What is going on here? That was a change.
Well, I'd be immediately concerned that the age block crisis should be dealt with. And that, in terms of sheer urgency, obviously takes precedence of other matters. The next most urgent thing is to establish the exact financial state of the country and see what action needs to be taken to deal with it. I have every reason to believe that it is, in fact, worse even than I had feared. It was a difficult period. So, yes, being elected is grand, yeah, but within an hour, I found myself in a lot more trouble than I expected to be in.
We were borrowing more and more abroad to fund current expenditure. International interest rates were enormous, so that it was a massive call on each budget to repay foreign debts and to pay the interest on the foreign debts. And they felt, economists would generally have felt that to raise revenue was important and to obviously control public expenditure were really, really important. So the question really was around how you did it.
First thing we had to do was that John Bruton brought in a mini budget, I suppose we'd call it an interim budget now, in June of 1981 that started out on the process of fiscal reconstruction. The January 82 budget was part of that. That, as we all remember, fell apart on a very simple issue.
Minister, good afternoon. What do you see as the main aim of your budget this afternoon? What's your main aim?
I think to restore national security, to get our economy in such a shape that we'll be able to have secure jobs in the medium term for the people of the country. It's going to be a fairly tough budget, but I believe that when it's seen in its overall context, it will be seen to be both fair and necessary.
Looking at taxation, one of the things you try to do is not to raise the top rate, because that tends to make for more distortions. You try to widen the tax base. So you look around to say, well, who's not included in the tax base? And one of the items that was not included in the tax base were children's clothes and children's shoes.
I thought it was a ridiculous decision. There wasn't a great deal of money involved, and it was a real Garrett-type decision, in the sense that the argument at the time was that women with small feet could buy children's shoes, so they had to be taxed. It was ridiculous.
I had been amused by the civil servants telling me that, of course, you can't distinguish children's shoes from women's shoes because some women have smaller feet than some children. I suppose this is a joke. And that became the reason the thing failed. It wasn't the reason at all. Henry was interested in subsidies and food subsidies in particular. So never make jokes in politics. It doesn't work. Sense of humour can be disastrous.
We knew at that time that we didn't have a majority, that it was a high-risk strategy, and we had two choices. One choice would be to sit there in government and make staying in government our priority, and to do, the absolute minimum just to stay in office. The other was to actually confront the problems that we had, go forward and deal with them as best we could, and let the Dáil decide whether it would accept what we believed was right or not. And that's the course we took. And it didn't come off, but I don't have no regrets about it.
Well, I think when that budget was going through the Dáil, and am I right about this, Rory, that the actual vote wasn't on children's shoes? I mean, the vote, the first vote was on spirits. I think it was on the beer and the changes in the budget and that, and it was clear then when that vote was lost that in fact they never even got to the VAT on children's shoes.
And it was the only time a government ever fell on a budget vote.
That's right. And of course, there's no discretion. I was actually a senator at the time. I had lost my seat, and I recall when it happened, and it meant that there was instantly a general election. It was electrifying. Suddenly, Leinster House was just a mayhem of people running around with boxes of envelopes and trying to get to phones and calling up people and doing all sorts of things. And it was pre-mobile phone, pre-instant communication. Because an election...
The budget that day was the 27th of January.
Yes.
So it was a middle of
a winter election. And
it
was going to be a 21-day sprint.
That's right. The thing is not to get too upset about things like that and realise every thing that happens which looks bad can be turned around to be good in certain circumstances. You tackle it right, and don't get too upset when you get a temporary reversal of that kind.
Winter mornings can be dreary. Why not brighten your day with TV3? Feel better about your family life with all new Jeremy Kyle.
Well, explain it to me then before I lose my mind.
Catch up with the hot topics of the day with the morning show and midday. Then add a bit of glamour to your lunchtime with Expose. And get your celebrity fix from brand new episodes of Queens of Chat, Oprah and Ellen.
Hey, Justin!
Hey, girl.
Fun!
Spend your day with TV3.
Quit your jibber jabber. You ain't hurt. You pathetic. If I ever catch you acting like a crazy fool again, you're gonna meet my friend Pain. Snickers, get them nuts.
Here are the latest games created in Little Big Planet 2. First up is in Venice. Watch out, the whole place is sinking. Meanwhile in Rio, this carnival dance-off will test your rhythm skills. And it's all engines go by the Mediterranean in this 4-way street race. That's just 3 of the 3 million games and counting created for you in Little Big Planet. Little Big Planet 2, only on PlayStation 3. The game is just the start.
He's not just bringing you today's news. It's a sign of love. Love them back with new recipes from Caesar. Selected ingredients individually prepared for all the balanced nutrition he needs every day. Caesar, love them back.
When you bring home the €38 landline and fixed broadband bundle from Vodafone, you bring value home. No strings, no catches, and it's not a promotion. It's just best value landline and fixed broadband. Bring value home, only from Vodafone.
Call the party line 1550 69 69 69 or text FLIRT to 57333. Chat to single girls in your area. Listen to hundreds of intimate personal ads. Make friends and maybe more. Party line, the fun way to meet single girls. Call 1550 69 69 69 or text FLIRT to 57333.
JLS with special guest Ollie Murs. Selman Park, Limerick, June 26th. Tickets are on sale this Thursday at 8 a.m.
On a cold morning, you just can't beat a warm bowl of Flahavans. A tasty, nourishing breakfast that's ready in minutes and keeps you going right up to lunch. No wonder everyone warms to it. Flahavans sets you up for life.
Thanks. My pleasure. Thanks. Thanks.
With Citroën Welcome Reward, government scrappage and Citroën scrappage on the Citroën C3, you'll have 3 reasons to thank Citroën this January.
Do you see yourself as a bit of a culinary genius? Fancy yourself as the next Gordon Ramsay? Well, if you can tell your Pinot Grigio from your peanut butter and you've realised that a tomato is actually a fruit, then listen up. Everyone's favourite show, Come Dine With Me, is coming to Ireland. And you can take part. With €1,000 up for grabs, we'll pit 5 strangers against each other in a bid to find the perfect dinner party host. If you think you're up for the challenge, then call 1530 99...
Following the February general election in 1982, Charles Haughey was returned as Taoiseach.
He operated differently to those who went before him, and he caused great trepidation, fear among not just younger people like myself at the time, but older ones too.
He had an enormous lust for power, and he had a lust for life and the good things in life. And he certainly became a person who regarded those around him who perhaps had a different point of view, perhaps questioned something he said, in the main as enemies. And the end result of that was that certainly by the 80s, he was surrounded by sycophants.
That was the period when the phones of 2 journalists were tapped. Geraldine Kennedy and Bruce Arnold.
There were a lot of suspicions around at the time. A lot of people were being watched and were being followed. And there was a terrible atmosphere of fear around among the politicians themselves. So was I suspicious? I suppose maybe I was, but did I let that interfere with my work? No, I didn't, because you couldn't live without a telephone as a journalist. I felt all the time that I had every right to be making these telephone calls. I was living in a democracy. I was reporting on what was going on in Dáil Éireann, and that I had every right to make phone calls to find out.
All over the world, journalists' phones are tapped for reasons of national security. This was different. This was for internal political reasons because the cabinet was leaking information and Charles Haughey used the apparatus of the state for purely party political reasons. And this was unprecedented. It wasn't to do with the security of the state. It was for his position within Fianna Fáil. And it was in a different category from anything that we'd seen before. Just about as everything else about Charles Haughey was. He didn't know the difference between right and wrong. His perception of what was an appropriate thing to do in whatever circumstances was out of everyone's window. He didn't obey the rules because he didn't know what the rules were.
I don't think there is any conclusive evidence anywhere to prove categorically that he authorised the phone taps or that he viewed the transcripts.
There was a feeling that there was a threat to democracy at that time and that things were happening that should not have been happening. And it's very hard to conjure it up all these years later now, the sort of atmosphere that was there. People were afraid. They were afraid to be seen meeting a journalist. They'd be afraid to be talking to you in the corridor. And the very strange thing about it then was that they decided they'd ring you at home instead so they wouldn't be seen with you. And then you turn out and you're tapped. Yeah.
And that was the sort of atmosphere you lived in at the time. If you were seen to be opposed to the power that was, in any sort of treatment to you was fair enough, and you were subjected to things that wouldn't normally be acceptable in a normal democracy.
Associated with that government, there were 3 attempts to overthrow Haughey's leadership from within Fianna Fáil. There was an abortive attempt after the election in February-March before the new government took office. Des O'Malley was about to challenge him, Des O'Malley, who subsequently set up the PDs, about to challenge him and withdrew at the last minute. As that year went on from when they took office, it was rightly described by Conor Cruise O'Brien as the Goo-Boo government because of the grotesque, unbelievable, bizarre and unprecedented things that happened during it. By the following, I think it was October, there was another heave, and this one was led by Charlie McCreevy.
When Charlie Haughey assumed leadership of Fianna Fáil in December, you might remember he did a celebrated TV broadcast in January 1980, where, still being played, he says the country is living way beyond its means, which was totally in line with the economic philosophy which I had, and one of my reasons for supporting Charlie Haughey. But between that and the election in June 1981, he did absolutely nothing about it for the problem that he diagnosed quite correctly himself. There are many reasons put forward why he didn't do that. The late Mr. Haughey would say, as he said to me many years later, well, one of the reasons was that he had a very divided party and that he wasn't in a position, say, to take a very, very strong line. But whatever the reasons, he didn't do it. And I became more agitated and vexed because the man whom I had supported on the lines that he was going to do something was actually doing quite the opposite. I put down a motion of no confidence in Charlie Haughey. This had never, ever, ever been done in the history of the Fianna Fáil party. And the divisions in the party were intense and immense, and awful things were done on all sides by us, awful things politically.
Can I ask you, how are you going to deal with the McCreevy no confidence motion?
Well, it'll be decided by the party on Wednesday. Full vote of the parliamentary party. We will take a very clear and positive decision on this occasion.
Will it be a secret ballot or an open vote?
I shall press very strongly for an open roll call vote, for the reason that I believe that the people in the Fianna Fáil organisation in the different constituencies are perfectly and fully entitled to know how their deputies vote on this particular issue. So I believe that there should be an open vote. Everybody on this occasion must stand up and be counted.
The result of that motion was 58 voted in favour of Haughey and 22 voted against. And the media then dubbed this the Club of 22. Reporters are always interested in what's different, what's sort of oppositional. So the focus was on this 22 people within Fianna Fáil who refused to back their leader.
I think Haughey had reached a state of mind where politicians didn't do service to the state was there to do service for them. And I think he reached the point where he saw the organs of state as to be available at his beck and call to serve him insofar as he could control them when he was in office. And I think he saw the Fianna Fáil party as something that he could control. What I saw happening sort of in the houses of the Oireachtas in the 80s was the extent to which those who were outside his milieu were cold-shouldered. I mean, they were almost pariahs. In fact, if someone on the Haughey wing was seen having a drink with someone on the anti-Haughey wing, already there would be stories out about them. It was a very, very strange period in politics.
Charlie had this notion of himself that, first of all, he had been elected leader of Fianna Fáil and therefore should not ever be challenged again, that he'd got the job and that was it. And it was up to him to say when he'd leave. That Fianna Fáil, the party, was the nation, was Ireland. Therefore, Haughey himself was the embodiment of our country. He was Ireland. And to challenge him, to threaten him, was treason. And Sean Doherty, at one stage, as Minister for Justice, actually sought the opinion of the Attorney General to see if people who were opposing Haughey could be charged with treason. He sought to find out, could they be arrested? Could TDs be arrested on their way to the Dáil? And apparently, they can't. And he was advised that they couldn't. I mean, that's how grotesque, to use Cruz O'Brien's word, things became in terms of how Haughey saw himself, how those around him saw him, and the depth of their loyalty to him, which he demanded, and how he saw himself. Quite extraordinary.
Despite surviving the vote of no confidence, Haughey's government soon collapsed when the Workers' Party and independent TD Tony Gregory withdrew their support over a Fianna Fáil policy document called the Way Forward, which would have led to widespread spending cuts. Another general election was called for November 1982.
We knew that there was great instability about that government, and when we saw the way they were going about constructing this economic plan, which was finally their downfall, called the Way Forward, we knew they weren't going to last very long, and we needed to be as ready as we could be for an election when it happened, and to come back into office.
And of course we got back in, as I thought we would.
Just a quick reminder, we've another great documentary tomorrow night at 9 as we investigate the disappearance of Jojo Dollard. Don't miss Crime in Mind. And if you want to take a look at all of the listings for tomorrow, go to our website, tv3.ie.